Hello, hello.
Hello.
We are here today with
Do
oh yeah,
episode one.
and we're hitting it off strong.
Yeah.
I hope so.
With
Yes.
one of the most loved professors
Aw.
on campus.
Yes.
I hope so.
You
Yes.
are. So firstly, how's your semester going?
So far, so good. I'd have to say. I mean, you probably want longer answers than that.
Right.
I'm teaching a senior seminar that I'm really enjoying, although my students aren't reading.
Okay.
And I'm teaching a sophomore qualitative research methods class, which my students aren't reading. So if you're listening, do your readings, everybody.
So how do you deal with students who don't do their readings?
Well, it's a challenge. On Wednesday in my seminar, I actually made them read in class because the entire class was premised on a discussion about the reading.
Mhm.
So if they're not going to do the reading, they don't have anything to discuss.
So what one of our professors has started doing is when nobody does the reading, he makes us write like long discussion posts in class and then 600, 700 words long. So then we have to do the reading.
See, you probably shouldn't have told me that because that sounds like a really mean idea.
It is.
So yeah, I might start doing that, everybody.
We started not liking him that much.
Yes.
Well, do your readings.
Well,
But
we
we
do
have
the
our own
readings.
problems
Yeah.
as well.
There are tricks, there are tips to get through your reading with less pain.
Please share them.
I don't know that I can. I don't know that I should because then you'll use them and you won't do your readings.
But we will do the readings, right? Is it better to? do
Well,
the
okay, all right.
readings?
Let me give you, for instance. So, for those of you who might be planning on going to grad school, or even who want to go into like government policy, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages that you need to get through and be familiar with. But see, the key is be familiar with, not know eidetically from beginning to end. So, my first year in my PhD, my first class in my PhD, I was taking a class on folkloristics with Dan Benamos. And the first week was introduction, and this is what we're going to do, and this is what I expect you to already know. And these are people who've already finished their master's degrees, so these are pretty advanced students. And he says, "All right, so there are four of us in the class. Dan makes number 5, so this is a super intense class." And he says, "We're going to run the first half of the semester with the students running the discussions." You've all done that, but in grad school, it's really super intense. You're not just like doing a 10-page paper. So Aaron, alphabetically, you're going to be this. That wasn't the first time I cursed my parents for naming me AA because I'm always first alphabetically, unless Amir's in the room. He said, "You're gonna lead the first week's discussion." We met once a week for 3 hours, not our 3 hours where it's actually 180 minutes. You're gonna lead the first class, and here are the readings. And it was some fundamental texts in German folkloristics. The total page count for week 2 was over 1,500 pages. And I was responsible for the discussion, which meant I was responsible for reading all 1,500 pages, not 10 pages or 20 pages or even 50 pages like I ask some of you to do. So in 7 days' time, I had to go to the library and get the books because they had been out of print for decades. And then I had to read them along with all of my other classwork. And I worked. And also, I was working 20, 25 hours a week loading trucks for United Parcel Service. And I had a kid. And I was married. So, and I had 1,500 pages to read. Right. So, and then here's where it gets real good. Because I was working at UPS, I threw my back out.
Oh, no.
I couldn't move. I spent most of that week on my back, but at home we had the ugliest coffee table that I've probably ever seen, but it had a glass top.
Right.
So I opened the book up and I put it on top of the glass and I lay on my back under the table and I read, and because I couldn't move,
You had to.
I kind of had nothing else to do, and I made it through, and I led a pretty good session. But here's a little secret: I didn't actually read all 1,500 pages. It was impossible to do. It's impossible to do
Yeah.
unless you're a speed reader, which I'm not. So in grad school, there are, if you don't know them already, there are particular tricks and tips that I will teach my students to economize your reading and to make it more efficient, not to get out of your reading.
Right.
I should underscore, but rather to make your time reading more efficient and more effective.
Right.
So, for example, always read the introduction and the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to give you a basic outline of what the thing is.
Right.
If it's an academic monograph, the first chapter often will say, in chapter 1, I discuss XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 2, I build on Y by discussing case studies 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 2, I connect Y to X and Z by talking through a discussion on phenomena, right? And then by doing that, you get a sense of what the author's argument is going to be, and then you pick the parts that are most relevant to what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're reading 1,500 pages, now you've gotten that 1,500 pages down to maybe 300 pages that are most relevant to you. It works the same with journals too. Always read the abstract. Do not cut and paste the abstract, but always read the abstract. It's going to tell you if the article is reasonable for your research. This doesn't always work if it's a class assignment, because if you're assigned to read it for class, well, you got to read it for class, whether it's relevant to your work or not. But for your own research, these are really, really strong tools. Figure out what the author's talking about. If there are terms that you don't know, you're not familiar with, Control F, right? And see how the author uses those. If there are particular reasons you're reading the author because you want to know how they apply Foucault's concept of governmentality, for example.
Right.
So you're only interested in discussions of governmentality. Control F governmentality and read all the sentences and paragraphs that talk about governmentality. Leave everything else to the side.
Mm-hmm.
You can, and my colleagues on the faculty are going to hate me for this, but you can also use this cleverly for your class readings to pick out parts of the text to become really masterful over.
Yeah.
So
I've done that.
so that when the questions come, you know everything about governmentality.
Right.
You can't connect it to anything else. But when they ask, you're like, oh, yep, I know that. And it makes it look like you've done the reading. Yeah, it makes you look like you've done the reading. Yeah. All of your professors have done this. Every single one of them have done this, because that's the only way to get through grad school.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Yeah.
Great insights.
Yeah.
So let's begin with.
Yeah, this was just warm up.
Okay.
So how was your childhood like? Where did you grow up?
All right. Honestly, my childhood was idyllic. It's that sort of storybook childhood that when you watch a movie or read a book about childhoods in America, I grew up on a farm. I had a brother. We fought all the time, hammer and tongs, but there were birch trees to climb. There were 5 apple trees to eat. We had grapevines. We had a cherry tree. We had, was it apricots or peaches? We never got any because the birds always got to them before we did. But it was a 3.5 acre farm. The farmland itself had been sold off. We lived in the middle of farm country, but we had neighbors up the road with a boy my age, so we could ride bikes and go through the fields and stuff, climb trees, eat apples, throw hedge apples at each other. We'd leave the house in the morning and we'd disappear for 8 or 10 hours. Parents didn't check in on us. They weren't worried. We'd come back at dark. We'd eat dinner. I mean, it was idyllic.
Okay. What state were you in?
I was in central Illinois, the breadbasket of America.
Okay.
So surrounded by cornfields, mostly corn, some soybeans, not so much wheat.
Okay.
Not like that matters, but lots of corn.
Fair. So what's like a characteristic of Illinois that you really like?
Oh, I left Illinois the second I could.
Oh.
So what's a characteristic of Illinois that I like? I mean, I guess my dad still lives there. My brother still lives there. The Chicago Cubs.
Mm-hmm.
I like them. Chicago's great. I love it. It's my favorite city.
Right.
Illinois was flat and it was boring and it was kind of racist and it was really close-minded.
Mm-hmm.
But again, my childhood was idyllic. I I had a good education. I had great teachers. They encouraged my curiosity. They encouraged me to read. They encouraged me to explore. They discouraged closed-mindedness. Um, yeah, it was just, I don't really have bad memories of my childhood. It wasn't, we, my parents divorced when I was very young, young enough that I understood they weren't going to be together anymore, but I had no clear understanding why. And that was tough, but not like traumatizing or anything. I was gonna go so as a consequence, my mother was a high school teacher my entire life, so we didn't have a lot of money. We drove the cheapest car, but I never wanted for anything. I mean, I guess I know now that we didn't have a lot of money, but I never really recognized that we didn't have a lot of money because, one Christmas I got a new bicycle, and another Christmas I got this Star Wars Death Star playset. Like when I was 7, not when I was 17. And when I was in high school, my mom was able to buy a house because she got a small inheritance from a family member, and it wasn't the biggest house or the greatest house, but it was a nice part of the neighborhood in west side of Springfield. And we took vacations most years. It was driving vacations. We didn't fly places. We would drive to New York City to visit to visit her brother, or we would drive to Phoenix to visit her parents. My father's parents lived about 90 minutes away in a really small town in very, very rural Illinois. I'd see them every couple of weeks, spend the weekend up there. I mean, it was just
very cool and chill.
It was a storybook, chill kind of childhood. And I was always encouraged to go off on my own and be independent and explore stuff.
So why does a kid or guy from central Illinois come to Karachi at any point in their life?
I mean, I think I probably just told you, right? My curiosity was always encouraged. I was always encouraged to read. I was always supported in asking questions. I honestly don't quite know how she did it, having now raised a child myself. But when I asked to do stuff, my mother always let me. I'm sure she got support from my father, but it's not a discussion we've ever had. So like when I was in 5th grade, there was a foreign exchange opportunity. And so we got a foreign exchange student from Paris, Pierre Corbeau, and then I went to Paris for 6 weeks, right? And when I was about the same age, I wanted to join the band. And so I got a saxophone. I have no idea where it came from, but we got a saxophone. And my teachers were the same. I had really, really good teachers. They weren't, the number of bad teachers I had who were mean or bullying or whatever, I can count on one hand. I didn't appreciate it at the time, I guess. But so what that did was it turned me into a person who wasn't afraid to go try things.
Right.
When I became old enough, actually the year my daughter was born, I got my first motorcycle, and I rode it 2 days after I got it. I rode cross country. And I did that every year for the next, until I moved here, without maps, right? I just get on and say, I want to go to, Chicago, say from Philadelphia. And I know Chicago's west of me. So I'm going to head west, right? And if something off in the distance kind of appealed to me, I'd turn left or right, and I'd go and say, okay, I turned left, so I'm going south. So in order to get Chicago, I need to go west more and north. And if you pick a target like St. Louis, which has the big arch, or Chicago, which is an enormous city, you can't really miss it, right? As long as you're headed in the right direction. So I would do that every year. So then,
what age?
I mean, my daughter had just been born, so I mean, I'm in my early 20s at this point. Prior to that, I'd been in school, so I didn't have my own vehicle. Then I was in yeah, by the time I was in graduate school, our daughter was born, and I had my first motorcycle. It was a Honda CX500 with a big fairing. It was cool. It was awesome. I mean, also, those of you, I think everybody now knows that my wife is here.
Yeah.
Super supportive. I mean, she just had a baby. I was like, yeah, you want to ride across country on a motorcycle? Okay, don't get killed. And that was it. And so when I started doing my PhD work and started doing research in India, I took a lot of public transport, but at my first opportunity, I bought a 50cc TVC, an old moped, and I drove that everywhere in exactly the same way I went across the U.S. I want to go see Mahabalipuram. That's north of here, and then I would just go north, right? I guess I only mention it because then I raised my daughter, and people my age, her friends' parents were very, very different. And I think there's a lot of press about it, and there's a lot of writing about it, and there's a lot of, complaining about it. But the people who raised my daughter's friends were very, very different from me. A lot of them were helicopter parents. A lot of them were very, very involved in even the most tiny details of what their children were doing. Our daughter would go out the front door and say, "I'm going to go to the woods," and we'd say, "Okay, come back before dark." And she'd come back before dark with like animal corpses that we could then dump in buckets of bleach and clean off and then re-articulate the bones. And her friends didn't do that kind of stuff. So that's how honestly, that's how I ended up in Karachi. I get my PhD. I'm working in South India. I'm a South Asianist by training. It's 2011. Habib starts advertising around the world, and I was like, I can try. I can apply. Let's see. Yeah. And so I applied. Very long process. They were just starting. They didn't know, they didn't know how to hire faculty. It took like 18 months and 7 interviews. It was hugely long. But eventually I told my wife that I had applied to the job. What's the point in saying, if they're not interested and they're not going to pursue, there's no point in saying I've applied to Pakistan. Yeah. So eventually I told her, we had a conversation, and then they made an offer, and then we had more conversations. And much like the summer motorcycle trips, she said, "Okay, well, you can go, and we'll check back in. We'll check back in a year, and we'll see what it's like."
And don't get killed.
2012. That was a very important thing to say. If you're going to Karachi, don't get killed.
Especially if you're white.
So I was in a South Asian Studies program at Penn, which means there are lots of South Asians. We had Indians and Pakistanis. We had a couple of Bangladeshis, right? All of the Pakistanis said the same thing. Yeah. The first thing that says, "Why are you going to Pakistan?" I left Pakistan. Yeah. Why are you going back? And then they would say, "Don't get killed." And so I came, and inshallah, I haven't been killed yet. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Okay.
Spirit of adventure.
There was so much there. Okay, I'd like to talk about what you were doing in India and how that experience relates with Pakistan experience.
Okay, so I was doing my dissertation research. My dissertation was on post 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami recovery, right? So when I first went to do preliminary research in 2005, I had no idea what I was going to study. 2005, because the tsunami had literally just happened.
Where did you go exactly?
I was centered around Pondicherry, which is in the south. It's about 4 hours by bus south of Chennai. It is coastal. It's only about 23 square kilometers. It's a very small metropolitan area. It is it's what's called a union territory. It's not quite a province or a state, but it is its own administrative unit. The union territory, what is now called the Union Territory of Puducherry, because they've excised the Anglicization of it, now consists of one city, Pondicherry, and 3 other small towns, Mahayanam and Karaikal, which is also kind of a city. But they're all in different parts of the peninsula. So they're all quite separate from one another. But I was working with the Putnavar fisher populations in Puducherry and in Karaikal, which is about 2.5 or 3 hours by bus, even further south on the Arasala River, just south of the former Dutch colony of Tarangambadi, which I just find it fascinating that there's a former Dutch colony in India. So I was working with a couple of fisher populations in a couple of villages outside of Karekol and outside of Puducherry. Um, my main research village was actually Vambakirabalaya, which doesn't mean anything to anybody. But by the time I returned there in 2008 to do my primary research, I had decided to study uh, I decided to study the living memory of instances of flood among the Putnavars, because the Putnavars, as a maritime fisher people, basically live in water. The Coromandel coast of India is largely sand dunes. It's either rocky or it's sand dunes. These dunes can be 8 to 10 meters high. And they have small villages that are built on the dunes because the dunes are flood resistant. So because sand is porous, even if the water comes, it drains very, very quickly. But because the dunes are typically, 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 meters up, the flooding likelihood is lessened. But of course, nobody could escape the tsunami. Everything flooded. But the response in the former French territories, in the Union Territory, was very, very different from the flooding in the former British areas. So just south of the Puducherry province territory is Cuddalore, which was a big British coastal area. And not only were the effects of tsunami very different in Cuddalore, but the response by the government, which was the government of Tamil Nadu rather than the government of Union Territory of Pondicherry, was very, very different, which was really, really interesting to me. But when I talked to the Putnavars about flooding, they would say, well, the tsunami was extraordinary. It never floods here. I mean, it's never flooded here. And I was talking to people who were my age at that time, people who were my parents' age at that time, people who were older than my parents at that time, I was talking to people who had been educated when Pondicherry was still French. It was, it did not join India in 1947. They didn't have a plebiscite to join India until the 1950s, and they didn't formally join India until 1962. So I was talking to people who were educated and remembered going to French school. People who would hail me, they'd see me coming and they would hail me in a very heavily Tamil inflected French because they assumed, oh, here's a white person, they must be French, right? So I was exploring what I was calling the parsonary memories of flood in the region, and so I was making this theoretical distinction between living memory, what people remember because they're alive, right, and parsonary members, which for me was the utilitarian living memory. So what memories did people pass on in their families to their children, to their neighbors within the community? What living memories were intentionally retained and communicated, and for what purpose? So why were people who had been kicking around since Pondicherry was French saying that flooding had never happened when I had in my possession 40 years of documentation of floods that had happened in Pondicherry? What was the purpose of this narrative that they were telling? And so my research had two prongs. One was, what are the purpose of these parsonary memories? What function do they have? How do they move through communities? How do they stitch communities together? And how do they serve as a foundation for interaction with government and non-government agencies who then are coming to them to remediate after flood disaster? Right? And so I had two historical points. There was a big flood with a lot of documentation in 1977. And then there was this 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. The 1977 flood was monsoon flood. It was just from the rains. So structurally, they were very different kinds of floods, but functionally, they had very similar kinds of responses. The difference being that because the 77 flood was meteorological, the government had warning and they actually went through the region. This didn't happen in Tamil Nadu. This didn't happen in Cuddalore. This happened in UTP, right, where the government would send trucks through the villages,
Yeah.
banging drums and yelling through bullhorns. There's a terrible storm coming, move to high ground.
Right.
And yet nobody I spoke to either remembered this flood, or if they remembered it, they said, oh yeah, but that wasn't a flood. Tsunami was a
Yeah.
flood,
Mm-hmm.
but this wasn't a flood.
Right.
And it turned out that it was one of those interesting linguistic ticks that kind of is the bread and butter of anthropology. The word that the word in Tamil for flood, velam, is the word that the Putnavars use not for flood but for ocean current. And so when you ask about velam, they say, well, inge velam bandala, floods never come here.
Mhm.
If you're talking to a farmer and you say, well, flood, inundation.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure out the first, I don't know, several months of my
Right.
field work. Not only would they say flood never comes here, they would give me the strangest look. Like, velam never comes here. What are you what?
Yeah.
I came to learn that they use that word in a very different sense.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, ocean currents don't come on land. They're ocean currents,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I was asking the wrong question. And once I learned what question to ask, I was like, oh, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then they would make distinctions. That 77 flood, there was another one in 84. I mean, it's like Pakistan in that
Mhm.
way. There are periodic floods. Sometimes
Yeah.
they're really, really terrible. And sometimes they're just only really bad.
Yeah.
But the Fishers made a distinction between flood, inundation, water coming into their homes and staying for days and weeks on end,
Mm-hmm.
and the events where water would come and then leave, right? So if you have a house built on a high drainage sand dune, the water may come, you may have 3 or 4 inches of standing water, only because it came so fast all at once, but it immediately starts draining and it just takes time to drain through the sand dune. The government called those floods, farmer castes called those floods, city people called those floods, but the Putnavars did not call those floods because they live on the ocean. Of course, water is going to come into our homes.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing is that it goes away. And with tsunami, it didn't go away.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one part of my research. And the other part of my research was to look at the actual mechanisms of response by the government of Pondicherry in how they responded to the immediate recovery in 2005, 6, and 7, and then how they planned forward against other floods. And what were the historical reasons why the flooding in Pondicherry wasn't as bad as it was just north of the Union Territory or just south of the Union Territory in Cuddalore. So that was my research.
So how many languages do you know?
Well, there's know and there's speak and there's this and there's that. I can do research in 4 languages: English, German, French, Spanish. I used to be able to, I mean, if I'm really honest with myself, I used to be able to read Tamil.
Mm-hmm.
That was my research language in South India. But I haven't used it since I came here. And I don't know what other people's experience with language is, but if I don't use it, it goes away.
Yeah.
Right. And I haven't used it in 10 years. And so it could come back with a little bit of brushing up, but
Mhm.
I can't honestly say I can still use. Like if somebody came to me and talked to me in Tamil right now, I could probably ask how their family is and ask them to please make me some dosa and say, no, please, I'm too full to eat anything more. But beyond that, I'm not sure I could say much. I am functionally illiterate in Urdu. I have been struggling to learn it since I got here. It's taken me about 10 years to become modestly proficient in being able to hear people and understand, but not necessarily like people can talk to me in Urdu and I can respond appropriately in English.
Mhm.
There are certain kinds of conversations that I have all the time that I can have without thinking. I had gotten to the point in my old neighborhood where I could, stand on my terrace and shout down to the boys in the street or the chokidar to
Mhm.
people, and I have those kinds of conversations and fairly fluently without really thinking about it. And then I moved to a different neighborhood where the home language isn't Urdu, and I felt myself like I had just arrived back in Karachi again, and it was kind of a step back. So I can understand it. I can watch TV shows. I can watch movies. I know it's in Punjabi, so don't correct me. I didn't do so bad watching The Legend of Maula Jat over the weekend. There were certain things that I was able to pick up, and there were certain things that I knew what the relationship was, but I couldn't quite make that translation. So I have functional use of Urdu, but I never really learned how to read it because as an anthropologist, that wasn't my concern. And when I tried to learn to read it, y'all print so small.
Yeah.
Like the newspapers and the
Yeah,
it's so
very
and then if it's printed on newsprint, it just bleeds and
I
it
know,
becomes
yeah.
this thing, and I just
I
It's-
can't read it either.
it's really, really
If
hard.
it helps. Yeah.
I do better reading Hindi.
Really?
I do better reading Hindi because the script is bigger.
Hmm.
I mean, let's be real honest. The
Yeah.
script is bigger and it's
Yeah.
blockier and it's square and it's not as beautiful as Nastalik is to
Yeah.
look at. It's a bunch of squiggles and dots, and they're often right on top of each other.
Yeah.
And without having that daily practice, I have to sit there and figure out, okay, these two dots go with that squiggle and that goes with this, and so this has to be right.
Yeah.
But then you don't use in a lot of common everyday kind of writing, the diacritics aren't used, so I will almost invariably choose the wrong vowel sound,
Okay.
which then so I was in Liari the other day, and there was a sign that said Liari Town,
Yeah.
right? And I've seen Liari enough that I just recognize that word.
Mhm.
I don't have that automatic recognition that I have with English or even Hindi. So that the word town I really struggled with it because I chose the wrong vowel sound at every opportunity to choose a vowel sound, right? And with that va, it can be va, or it can be o, or it can be aw, or it could be right. And I went through every single variation and they were all wrong. I was like, what the hell is that word? And I tapped somebody next to me and they said, oh, that's Liari Town. So I struggle to learn to read. A few years ago, I really got attracted to Habib Jalib, and I know people say they want to learn how to read Urdu so they can read.
Are you talking about Ghalib?
No, Habib Jalib.
Yeah, there is one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
मैंने ये से ये कहा, right?
Yeah.
Habib Jalib, yeah. I know most people say they want to learn to read Urdu so they can read ghazal, so they can read. No, you know what? I want to read your most radical Marxist poet, Habib Jalib.
Right.
I find his poetry, I find it really inspiring, and I will sit and I will struggle through it to help sort of learn to read the prose. A lot of it hasn't been translated, so I have to struggle with it. But I find that really enjoyable.
Yeah.
I just don't have as much time to do it. And maybe I'll start reading Khalid because I've started reading Jalib, and but I think I'm exposed to a lot of Khalid here, and he's really hard.
Yeah.
He's really difficult. If you're learning a language, maybe don't start with Khalid.
Yeah.
I know at Penn, when you start reading Urdu, they start with Ghalib because you're supposed to be inspired by how lovely his language is, and his language is lovely.
Yeah.
But as a translation exercise,
Yeah.
it's really, really difficult.
It does. Yeah.
Whereas Jalib is writing, in the 60s and 70s for regular people, and so his poetry is much more accessible to me, I find.
So, do you have any interesting or funny stories to share from your time spent in Karachi?
Probably. I've been here 10 years. That's such a vague question. I'm sorry. It's one of those questions that puts you on the spot. Do I have interesting stories? Yeah, sure. I'm sure I do. What are they? You got me. You kind of put me on the spot.
Do people mistake you to be Pathan and start talking to you?
They used to all the time.
Yeah.
I used to, when Sunday Market was still up, I would go to Sunday Markets regularly, and I would be routinely mistaken for Pathan.
Right.
Usually when I was wearing shalwar kameez, to the point that, and 2012, 13, 14 were not great times to be publicly American.
Yeah.
It got to the point that it seems such an obvious dodge just to kind of avoid unwanted attention, that when I was at the markets and I was wearing shalwar kameez, I had this whole complex story about how my father was Pathan, but he migrated to North America before I was born and wanted me to be North American, and so he never taught me Pathan. So they would look at me and say, "Well, why do you speak bad Urdu but you don't speak any Pashto?"
Yeah.
And that's what I would say. I'd say, "Oh, well, my father wanted to be, American, and so he never taught me. But I came here, so I speak a little bit of Urdu, but it's not very good, and so I came here so that I could learn it better."
Yeah.
And I mean, there are ethical questions with that, but it kept the profile low, and I wasn't really hurt. And
Did people buy it?
Yeah, they were so happy. They were so happy. But the thing is, they would have been just as happy and welcoming and warm if I had said, "Yep, I'm an American. I look Pathan. I'm not, but I really like it here," and they would have been just as welcoming. It's just, I found that to be true anywhere I've traveled in South Asia. I think there's an additional layer in Pakistan because there are so few foreigners, because particularly Americans, because for the last, for my whole lifetime, we've been told that Pakistan is a terrifying place to come and don't ever come here. And so I think people generally are proud of their country, even when they kind of hate it or are angry at it and recognize it for all of its failings. And, we're going through a lot of those failings right now, but people still want to be proud of where they're from, even if they don't like the government, even if they don't agree with the policies. They do come from a home, from a city, or from a community, or from a village, or from someplace, and they like that place, and they love their families, and they love their neighbors, and they want to share that with people. I think people just generally, I mean, I am as curmudgeonly as you might ever want to be, but, I like doing that stuff. And now that I haven't lived in central Illinois for more than half of my life, I miss it. And I was really happy to go there the first time with my wife. And I was really happy to go there the first time and take my daughter there regularly when she was growing up, so she could see her grandparents and kind of grow up in a way kind of like I did. And I think everybody feels that way. And so whatever else may be going on politically or economically or anything else, when strangers come, generally you want to welcome them and share with them the best of that place, the things that you love about that place. And so I'm certain I could have said, "Nope, American, grew up in Illinois, don't speak a word of Pashto. How do you say tea?" or whatever. And they would have been like, "Oh, please come, let's tell you everything that we can about everything." But every message I was getting from the news, from Habib University, from my own consular staff was, "No, don't say you're American. Don't say where you're from. Try not to speak English if you can avoid it. Keep a low profile. Don't go on this road. You'll get murdered immediately. Don't go on that road. You're going to get killed immediately. If you go over there, you'll get kidnapped. If you go over there, you'll get food poisoning. In fact, stay in your home, and you shouldn't even be here. What are you even doing here?" And I try not to live that way. I try very much not to live that way, but they're unavoidable. And the realities were, in 2012 and 13, there were a lot of target killings going on. There were a lot of target killings of doctors, medical doctors. I realized, and when I started learning Urdu, one of the first phrases I learned was "ek aur doctor," the other kind of doctor, right? And actually, it was from a Hindi Urdu textbook, so it was maybe more Hindi than it is Urdu. I know when doctors were getting targeted, they meant real doctors. But educators were getting targeted, and
Yeah.
it was happening near my neighborhood, and it was happening far from my neighborhood, and it was happening here. And I mean, it just made, and then it was such a, Habib was such a small community at that time
Yeah.
that everybody was up in everybody else's business. So as
Okay.
soon as, so when I first got here, I didn't have a car. I was living in faculty in university housing, and they completely controlled my movements,
Okay.
which, I mean, I didn't know where I was going.
Yeah.
Which actually reminds me of that funny story that you want to hear. I didn't have a car. There wasn't any really, there isn't, while there's public transport, it wasn't wise for me to use it,
Yeah.
right? And so I used university transit everywhere. They had a handful of cars and they had a handful of drivers. And if I needed to go somewhere, they'd take me.
Mm-hmm.
And if they thought it was too dangerous to go, they'd say, "Oh, car's not available, sorry." Which, you know, is reasonable. It would have looked really, really bad for the organization, for the institution, to bring American faculty and then have them get kidnapped and murdered.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. So in that way, they controlled my movements. And then when they brought on a full-time security manager, you know, retired military, they were then all up in your business saying, "Oh, don't do this and don't go there and don't do that." They would give us periodic updates where they would show us maps of the city with no-go zones and all of this stuff. But that only lasted about 6 months. And I guess it was February of 2013, I got my first car.
Okay.
Okay, I got my only car. I still drive the same car. So I got my car. And at that point, they're like, "Okay, fine." And they never asked me another question ever again. My car was delivered to me. And I was like, "I'm going to go drive through this city that I've never driven through before." And I drive through the city. I forget where I went. I actually went to go do something. I thought, "Oh, no, I'll go drive myself." So I went and I drove myself, and I did the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got lost.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, no problem. I'll just get my phone." I left my phone on my desk at the office.
Mm-hmm.
So I am lost in Karachi with 6 months of experience in Karachi. At this point, I have very little Urdu or Hindi. I can say maybe hello and thank you, which is dhanyavad in Hindi. I mean, right? So it's there's even that. So I'm lost. I'm completely lost in this city, and I have no way to contact anybody and very little way to talk to anybody. I had been here long enough to recognize that you can stop and ask anybody for directions, and they will be happy to help.
Mm-hmm.
But they are as likely to have no idea what they are talking about,
Mm-hmm.
but deliver it very confidently. So I figured asking for directions is not going to be helpful. So I just started driving through the city.
Right.
I had no idea. I was just looking for something that seemed familiar. Eventually, I found my way to this huge road. I know
I'm glad the petrol prices were not so high.
they weren't so high then, no. But I was free. I was driving on my own, right? This is the freedom that I had always had as a child. So it was really nice to be out and about, even though I was lost and, you know, kind of worried.
Mm-hmm.
So I find this big road, and I said, "Well, I'll get on this big road. This big road will take me somewhere." I know now that, I found out pretty quickly that the big road was Shadi Faisal.
Yeah.
But I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah.
So I picked Shadi Faisal and said, "Well, I'll just pick a direction and go and figure out what it is." And I drive and I drive and I drive and I drive and I drive, and things are getting quieter and quieter. And there's a lot of traffic, but there's less city. And then finally I'm at the airport. I'm like, "Oh, I went the wrong way." But now I kind of have a sense of where I'm at.
Yeah.
I still have no idea how to get from the airport to any place, but I know that the airport is the other direction from where I wanted to go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I have a landmark. So I drive past the airport because you have to, and I take the first cutting, and I come back around, and I drive 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 back the other way, looking for anything that would ring a bell. And I'm driving, and I see off to my right the Habit, which had just been built on Tipu Sultan. I was like, "Oh, I know that place. That place is close to work." Because at this point, this campus wasn't there. We were still in offices in Muhammad Ali Society. So
this was the phase where you were kind of building the curriculum and okay.
Yeah, this was the phase. So I see Habit. It's like, okay, I know there. I need to get over there, but it's Shadi Faisal, and there's this thing, and I have to drive to find some kind of cutting. I finally get myself turned around. I'm coming back. I'm driving really slowly because I don't want to miss Habit. Because I know if I miss Habit, then I'm gonna have to go like 4 miles out of my way to turn around again. I see Habit and I turn left. I'm like, okay, now I know what I can find. And I had been up and down that road enough because there were two offices. One was I said Muhammad Ali Society. One was actually in KDA, and the other one was in Bangalore Co-op Housing Society. So they were really effectively on either side of Tipu Sultan Road. And I'd gone up and down that road enough, and I knew I was on Habit, so I knew Habit could be reached from either of those offices because they were looking for housing for us, which meant that they were looking for plates and couches and stuff. And that was it. I wanted to go to Sutter and get cookware and stuff, and they're like, no, you have to go to the place where the where the elites. You're gonna shop at Habit. So I'd been to that place a number of times buying forks and things. So I knew if I could get there, I would be able to find my way. And I'd been on Tipu Sultan enough times that I recognized all of the landmarks that I could either get to the Bangalore Co-op Housing Society office, or I could get to the KDA Society office. And that's how I got home. And that was my super exciting adventure.
Love that. Okay. We're coming to the end of our show, even though I have so many other questions. We're gonna, so we got a question from a student of yours, and she'd like to remain anonymous, but she was asking about your mental health journey and what you have learned from it.
I don't think of myself as having taken a mental health journey.
Okay.
Which might be unfair because I have done things in the past. I am more careful now with self-care than I was many years ago. While I called my childhood idyllic, I was still raised a boy in America in the Reagan era. It was all very much self-sufficiency and be a man and boys don't cry and all of that kind of stuff. And so I became really stubborn. I'm still really stubborn. I became very cynical. I like doing things for myself. I don't like asking for help. I spent a lot of my life like this. And those are all well and good, but they're not really beneficial in the long term. We are social animals. And there's very little that we can actually do all by ourselves. I guess that all really started to change back in about 2013. I had been here for not quite a year. I got a small research grant to go do some archival research in the overseas archives in France to kind of follow up on my dissertation research. And I spent a month in Aix-en-Provence doing research at the archive. I would get up every morning. I would go to the archive when it opened at 8:30 and stay there until they kicked me out. But when they kicked me out, I would leave, and I didn't really know anybody. I didn't have a lot to do. So I didn't realize I was doing this at the time, but on the way back to my accommodation, there was a park. And I would go to that park every day after the archive, and I would sit on a bench. It was pleasant. It was spring. It was April. The weather in southern France in April is lovely. And I would just sit there, and I wouldn't read a book. I wouldn't play on my phone. I would just sit there. And what I was actually doing was practicing mindfulness. And I learned in that month how to sit with myself and just be. Right? In America, you can't do that. You have to be productive. You have to be active. You have to be doing things. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. So that's kind of how I grew up. And so I still feel that what we call Protestant guilt when you're not being a productive member of society. You feel this Protestant guilt that you're not supporting your family or building a chair or recovering a couch or painting the house or whatever. But I didn't have any of those things to do for a month. I didn't have to take care of myself really. I had a very nice. I was renting a room from a really terrific young man who was a junk dealer. But he was super interesting and he was super nice, and he let me use his kitchen and he gave me a room, and so. But I didn't have to take care of anything, and so I didn't have anything to do except my research, and I could only do my research during working hours because you can't take anything out of an archive. Uh, so 7 hours a day from 5 p.m. until I fall asleep at midnight or 1 a.m. There wasn't a whole lot to do except read and walk around the city and visit the historical places and look at pretty buildings and visit art galleries. Couldn't visit art galleries because they were all closed at 5, right? So there wasn't a lot to do. So I would sit on the bench for a couple of hours, and I would just sit there and I would be with myself, and I would work on not thinking, because my mind goes a million miles a minute, and I think about this, and then I start worrying about that, and then the other thing comes, and through doing that, I kind of learned to be very mindful of myself and where I was at mentally in a given time. And so then I would start walking through the city and just kind of be present in that moment. And it was really beneficial, because when I came back to Karachi is kind of this never-ending onslaught of sensation of input. But also, it's always, society is very family oriented, and I was here by myself, so there wasn't really anything to plug into. So there wasn't a social life to speak of. There wasn't family. I'm not a big movie goer. There weren't, there were a number of interesting art galleries that I would go to, but they're very small, so you go there for 40 minutes and you're done, right? So there was a lot of time to work. I could either work or I could, right, or just be, right? And so I started just being. And you can ask my wife back for another interview. She might very well disagree with this, but I think as a consequence of that, although it's been very challenging for me over the last 9 years to kind of keep that going, because this was 2013, I am better now at being with myself, where I'm at and who I am, than I was any time in my life up until 2013. I struggle with bad feelings. I struggle with imposter syndrome. I mean, Lord, I'm not sure. There are two kinds of PhDs. There are PhDs who struggle their entire lives with imposter syndrome, and there are PhDs who are nothing but ego. And sometimes that ego is there to cover imposter syndrome. But I've never met a PhD who isn't one of these two things. So, I mean, that's a mental health issue. You struggle with imposter syndrome, right? I've got the same kinds of self-doubt that lots of people have, but that effort that I made in 2013 and 14 and 15 to just sort of be present has, I'm not going to say it's centered, because I'm not centered. I still fly off the handle. I still get angry. I still do stupid things. I still hold on to things way too long. I mean, I still regret things that I did in India in 2000. It's like, why did I do that? I'm so dumb, right? Which, come on, 2008, 15 years ago, let it go already. But it's helped. It's helped. I'm not quite the ball of anger that I used to be.
So, what is your version?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know how much time we have. So when I finished my master's degree, I moved to Philadelphia with our small child. My wife was at Temple University, and I got a job teaching performing arts at a primary school, primary, and then it was primary and lower secondary. And I said that I am going to make I'm not going to take any of my work home. So you've never been a grade school teacher, but they have lots of grading to do, lots of paperwork, lots of things they have to plan, lots of administrative, bureaucratic requirements they have to meet. And then they give all those worksheets, and they have to grade all of those worksheets. And it's just hundreds and hundreds of worksheets every week. And I made the decision that when I leave school, I am not going to take work home. And with so I worked there for 4 years, and with very, very, very few exceptions, I stuck with that. When the school day ended and I wrapped up my work, I left all of my work on my desk. I got in my car. I drove home. I picked up our daughter from daycare, and then we'd go home and we'd do our homework, or we would read. Once or twice a week, we would go to McDonald's and get some French fries, or we would do some shopping so I could cook dinner. I would set her up, then I would cook dinner, and the evening was for family. And I did that really, really well for 4 years. And then I got into grad school, and grad school is like all of you feel about undergraduate. You're always working. You never have any time for yourself. Every night's an all-nighter, except times like a million.
Okay.
Because, I assign you 50 pages and Dan Benamos assigned me 1,500 pages, except he's not the only one assigning me 1,500 pages.
Right.
And then you've got to do your own research, which requires hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of reading, right? So that was difficult. And, the structures of family support in the U.S. aren't great. And so in order to ensure that we all had health care, so that if there was an emergency or we, had to go to the doctor, I got a job loading trucks at UPS. I worked third shift. I went to work at 11 p.m. Work started at 11:30, and we loaded trucks until we were done. So sometimes, like February, we'd be done by 1:30 or 2. And if it was a busy time, if it was the summer, if it was Christmas, we would get done at 5 or 5:30. And I would come home and I would clean up, because loading trucks is very, very dirty work. And I would shower and I would make breakfast for my daughter. And then I would get on the train and I would go to campus, and I would go to my 10 a.m. class, and I'd have my 10 a.m. class. And then there was one couch on the third floor of the library that I could almost always find vacant after class ended. And I would go and nap for a couple of hours until my afternoon class. 3 days a week, I had TOML, which was always at 5 p.m. And so I was on campus usually from 10 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. I'd get on the train, I'd come home, I'd have dinner with my family, and I would go back to UPS. So work-life balance there was less good, but I think I always tried to put my family first. I made that commitment, and I think generally I kept it, except in those, I met my requirements, but there were some times I'm sure where I was unavailable. And then I came here, and I didn't have any family, and we were building a new university, and so I basically worked 20 hours a day, because the work was really, really interesting. I enjoyed what I was doing, and I had nothing else to do, so I might as well work. And so I did.
So, since you talked about your mental health, how do you feel about students at your wave coming to you and being vulnerable or being emotional, talking about the struggles? So, have you ever faced it? And if yes, how do you deal with it?
I face it all the time. How I deal with it. Actually, weirdly, this is very similar to a question the vice principal of the grade school that I taught at asked me during my interview. He said, "You have a student who comes to you in emotional distress. What do you do?" It's like, aha, see, I know what he's trying to do. He wants to see if I'm going to touch this poor little inner city child. And the answer to that is no. I got the job, so obviously I answered it correctly. It's different here, and every student is different. Every problem is different. Sometimes all I can do is listen. I'm not equipped.
Because even that means a lot to us.
Well, I'm not trained in this. I'm a human being who's had human problems and has had my own struggles, and I've gotten through them in particular ways, and I'm happy to share those generally. I can always empathize. I can sometimes sympathize, right? If I've gone through something similar. I get it. There's not a whole lot I can do, though. And there's not a whole lot I should do, because heaven forfend, I give bad advice and you follow it and something even worse happens. But I'm always happy to listen. It's the least I can do. I don't remember ever doing this when I was an undergrad. I don't know. Maybe that speaks to my poor self-awareness and bad mental health when I was your age. Or to the brokenness of American culture that tells boys to take care of things themselves. I'm not sure. I mean, how do I? It depends. It depends on the problem. It depends on the issue. It depends on the student. It depends on our relationship with the student. Um, my default as program director is there something administrative I can do here, right? Because that formalizes it, and so from a sort of like a legal juridical standpoint, if I formalize, oh, you have a problem and I have a solution, and it's a bureaucratic solution, but I can make a record, and I can say this is what I've done and I've taken these steps, and it also is helpful in that it will give students an action that they can take. So if there are all kinds of administrative solutions for all kinds of student problems. If a student is simply feeling overwhelmed because they're taking 5 courses or 6 courses or 7 courses, I mean, there's not a lot of administrative advice I can give there. All I can really do is listen and say, and if it seems like it would be helpful, share my own struggles with that kind of work. I mean, I like the 1,500-page folklore story. I think it's funny. I've told it lots of times, but it's true. And students are expected to do I do this too. I'm a faculty member and I write my syllabi and I know exactly what I ask my students, but students are often, not always, asked to do unreasonable amounts of work. Not in any particular given class, but what often happens, we all went to university. We all followed syllabi. We've all learned basically the same way. We all have the same patterns and habits. And really, I think what happens, and we've tried to address this a couple of ways, administratively, this is my go-to. Everybody wants to have a paper due in week 4. Everybody wants a paper due in week 8. Everybody wants a paper due in week 15 or 16. Mm-hmm. A lot of the reason why students feel overwhelmed is not because you've undertaken too much work or that you're incapable of doing the amount of work that's been assigned, but because there's not enough communication between faculty members. Mm-hmm. Everybody assigns all the work at the same time. Yeah.
It's coming at the same time.
That's what happens. Yeah. And then students get overwhelmed, and reasonably so. There's not a lot that we can do about that administratively. I do not want the university telling me when I have to assign things, due dates. I don't particularly like that the university makes us ensure that students know exactly what their grade is in week 8 or week 9 so that they can make withdrawal decisions. I do it anyway, but I don't like it being mandated. So, yeah, I guess that's my answer. I do what I can. Mm-hmm. It's not a very good answer. I said a lot more than that, but I do what I can.
So we have some interesting questions. The first is in the community episode, season 3, episode 10. Regional holiday music, which is the best song and why is it Troy's Christmas Infiltration?
Which is the best song and why is it Troy's Christmas Infiltration? I would say Troy's Christmas Infiltration is the second best song. I like Annie's song to Jeff because it's so stupid and it's such a perfect encapsulation of a kind of Christmas song that becomes popular every single year. Every year it's a different idiotic song. And I like the cynicism of it and I like the satire of it. Troy's Christmas Infiltration is catchy, but they don't have the best flow. Got to be honest with you. Abed's flow is not great.
So are you a Jeff, Britta, Shirley, Troy, Annie, Abed, or Pierce? Defend your position.
Like, am I pro this person or who do I think I'm more like?
Yeah.
If I'm more like, I'd have to say I'm more like Abed.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, taste-wise, pop culture-wise, I'm much more in the Troy Abed camp, right? Okay. So, and Yeah, interpersonally, socially, I'm closer to Abed than I am to
Mhm.
Troy. I'm not a charismatic charmer like Jeff. I'm not a misguided social activist like Britta.
Yeah.
I'm definitely not Annie, and yeah,
That leaves Abid.
it leaves Abed. I'm not racist, so I can't be Pierce.
Yeah, I thought
But I'm kind of old and out of touch now, so maybe I'm closer to Pierce without the racism. I don't know.
they surely do.
There's Shirley. I don't. My mom's
Are
a
you
Shirley.
motherly?
Um, a number of years ago, some of the students used to call me behind my back that they called me Poopo
Really?
until they found out that I knew they called me Poopo, and then they stopped it real quick. I don't think that's motherly. I think that's meddling, right? So
Yeah.
I was head of OAP. I was head of OAP for a couple of years,
Mhm.
and I tend to the last couple of years since COVID have been different, but I tend to be really involved in my advisees
Okay.
career. So I am kind of a poopo, but Shirley's not really a poopo. She's a mother, and my mother's a Shirley.
Okay. So, what is the best episode of Community?
I really like that Christmas episode, but I think probably if you're for a few paintballs more, I know it's the obvious answer,
Mhm.
but it's just such a clever
I know,
send
right?
up. It's just such a
so-
clever send up of the spaghetti western.
Have you seen Community, by the way?
No.
It's too good. It's-
Well, according to the person who has sent this question, your answer is incorrect.
Defend yourself.
What is your favorite Frank Zappa?
Oh wait, he did give the right answer. It's fistful
No,
of
it's
paintballs.
incorrect.
Incorrect. The answer is fistful of paintballs. That's what he said.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah, but he didn't say that answer.
okay. What is your favorite Frank Zappa spin-off project?
My favorite Frank Zappa spin-off project. Oh wow, that's a great question. Oh my goodness.
By the way, do you know who sent these?
Do I know?
Who sent these?
And I have no idea. Would you call Berlin a Frank Zappa spin-off project?
No idea.
Because Bozio was the singer for Berlin, and she also played for Zappa. But I don't know if it's really a spin-off. There was a violin player who Frank Zappa found named Junka. He was an electric violin player, but he's not really a spin-off. I'm gonna go again with the obvious standard. It's Captain Beefheart.
Okay.
It's Captain Beefheart.
Gotta be.
Particularly Trout Mask Replica, which I think is a genius album. As unlistenable as it is a genius record.
We understand what you were talking about.
So everybody, listen to Trout Mask Replica.
Yes.
What is the Hampshire College mascot?
Mascot. Hampshire College did not have a mascot when I was there. I tried for 3 years to get our mascot to be the Bleating Heart because we have a bunch of sheep and sheep bleat. They're liberals, so the Bleating Hearts. You may be referring to the breadfruit tree, which was the Hampshire logo when I was there, but they changed that to a weird geometric H in my 3rd year, and everybody hated it. So unless they've changed it, there is no mascot at Hampshire College.
Well, apparently it's a frog.
It's not a mascot. It's not a mascot. The frog, we've had frog books since the beginning, but it's not a mascot. See, a mascot is the thing that comes out at games.
Right.
It's not a frog. Frog is at best it's a hanger on.
Why haven't you watched David Lynch's masterpiece Dune yet?
Spite.
Why?
Spite. Honestly, it's spite. When I haven't watched Home Alone for the same reason.
You haven't watched Home Alone?
Nope.
That's like the only film that we.
There was so when Dune came out, David Lynch was such a thing. And people were like, "Oh, David Lynch finally did Dune. Dune's such a great book. Frank Herbert is the best sci-fi author ever." And I was like, "No, I don't need to be force-fed what sci-fi movies to watch."
Right.
And so I didn't watch it. And it was the same thing with Home Alone. It was like in theaters, and it never went away, and it never went away. I mean, at the time Home Alone came out, it was in theaters longer than any other movie had ever been in theaters.
Yeah.
Right? I was like, fine. If everybody likes it, I'm going to hate it just on principle. And then it just became a habit. I've just never seen Yeah.
Whatever is hyped up, you don't want it. Watch it.
I was a different person. I am not that person. I just saw Malajat. That was a hyped movie.
Yeah, but
right?
it's a Pakistani movie, so it's still in everywhere else.
Yeah, but everybody saw it here, so it's the same logic. But yeah, back when I was your age and younger, I was oppositional in that way. Just needlessly oppositional to be oppositional.
That essence of stubbornness.
That essence of stubbornness.
Home Alone is probably the only Christmas movie that we've seen.
I know the whole plot, and I've seen parts of it, but I never sat down at the beginning and watched to the end.
Okay. Fair enough.
Have you ever written a song for the ukulele? What was it called?
I've written lots of songs for the ukulele. One of them almost got me fired because I actually wrote it about my bosses at the grade school that I taught at. I wrote, oh boy, I haven't played ukulele I played it last week, but I haven't played any of my songs. I used to play it all the time, and I wrote a whole bunch of songs when I was in university. And I can't remember what any of them are, except one whose title I cannot share with you because
Okay.
it would be inappropriate for lots of reasons.
Okay, that's fair. This is a long question. If the giant eagles can rescue Sam and Frodo from Mount Doom at the end of Return of the King, why couldn't they just fly them there?
Don't start with this. That is such a nonsense question. Come on, that is not what the eagles are there for. First, as a narrative device, they can't take Sam and Frodo there because that completely ruins the narrative. But the eagles, by their very nature, held themselves apart from mortal existence, right? They weren't part of the elves or the humans or the dwarves. They're not going to do it.
I don't know what you're talking about, but I love the reaction.
Yeah. That's like if someone told us Shah Rukh Khan is a bad actor and this is how we
It's
react.
I don't know who asked it, but it's a tired question, y'all. Get a new question.
Right. Okay, so we're at the end of our episode.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Oh,
we
I
have-
have one interesting
Okay,
question.
go ahead.
So, do you have any interesting or funny student encounter?
I feel like that's a setup,
No,
and I'm not going to walk into it.
No. This is a very genuine. We ask this question to every guest.
Everybody?
Yes.
So the answer would be yes, and that is all the information that you are getting.
Come on.
No.
Just a little.
A little bit.
No, absolutely not. That seems like such a look. I don't know who any of these questioners are, right?
Right.
And so, but I'm here trying to figure out who is going to come up to me next and challenge me about the Eagles, right? Right. So if I do the same thing, students are gonna be, was that my students are gonna say, was that me?
Yeah.
Right. My advisees are gonna say, was that me? And if it was them, because the story I give is going to be so clearly, oh, that was me. That's super embarrassing. No, I'm not going to do that to my students. They don't.
Okay.
If it was a interpersonal interaction, they deserve that privacy. And if it was a public interaction and it's funny, it's probably embarrassing. And if it's embarrassing, they don't need to be embarrassed again.
Fair enough. Okay. So at the end of the episode, we ask all the faculty members who come here if they would like to ask us 3 questions. It could be as
Anything.
It could be us as student representatives of the student body, us
As
as
individuals.
students, or just
Anything.
I mean, I didn't meet either one of you until last month.
yeah.
So I'm not sure what I could ask. Obviously, you don't watch Community, so I can't ask you any questions about that. I'm not sure you're familiar with Giant Eagles, so I can't ask you anything about that.
We watch Bollywood.
Or it could be anything student related. University.
Well, I'm already up into all your business anyway. Do you watch Bollywood, or do you watch classic Bollywood? Like you watch the new films that come out, or you're talking you've seen Qaidi Azam and you've seen Mother India and
We've
you've
seen those
seen
as well, and we watch the new ones
The
as
new
well.
one. And we critique the new ones as well.
Okay. Yeah. There was a period when I was growing up, the public TV would play Bollywood movies every Saturday.
Really, in America.
In America, yeah. So from the time I got cable, which would have been about 6th grade, and through high school, I watched Bollywood movies every weekend, and it was it was the ones that weren't so good that they wanted to copyright protect them, so
Right.
they were free or they were easy to get access to,
Right.
or they were so old that nobody cared. So I've seen so many terrible Bollywood movies from the 80s and the 70s and the 90s. Have you seen Amar Akbar Anthony?
I have.
See, I like that movie. I didn't care for the remake, but I like the original.
There's a
It's nice.
remake?
There was, yeah. Who's your favorite Bollywood actor?
At the moment, Shah Rukh Khan, because he just made his comeback.
That is as tired as the giant eagle question. I'm
I
sorry.
know,
So-
but he's
So I like Shah Rukh Khan for the stardom that he has, but as like a very good actor and someone whose films I would really watch. I think I really liked Irfan Khan,
Mhm.
and I like Pankaj Tripathi, who has been in the
I actually like
business for now.
Shah Rukh Khan better off camera. Like his off camera persona is so much more interesting. He's so witty and he's so funny in any interviews.
It's he gives a good interview. It's true. It's
Yeah.
true. It's true.
And that's it.
Who's your favorite classic Bollywood actor?
I feel like I have to say Dev Anand at this point, but I'm not sure.
You have to.
Yeah, I feel like I have to.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
There's a comic actor in Tamil film named Vadivelu. Vadivelu.
Okay.
Very broad comic actor,
Mm-hmm.
but very good at what he does. But you have to watch Tamil films.
We watched the newer ones. We haven't watched any of the old ones.
Yeah, well, he was popular through the '90s.
Mhm.
Right about the time you were not born
born
yet.
yet.
Right about the time you were not born yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
With 2003.
2002.
He was still in movies in 2000, in the early 2000s, but he was aging. All of that broad physical comedy that he did,
Mhm.
not so easy when you're older and
Right.
getting fat.
And even the 90s comedy, it didn't really go into the, at least by the mid 2000s, it kind of felt a bit old, right?
Mm.
People weren't really going for that. Okay.
Okay,
So
Yeah.
how many cats do you have?
I have one cat, but I live with many more. We have 3 cats here. We have 3 more cats back in the U.S.
Who's looking after them?
Mother-in-law.
Mhm. So, what are you gonna do the rest of the day?
Grade your papers. Well, not your papers, but I got work to do.
I didn't expect that. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Thanks for
I
having me.
loved it. We loved this conversation.
Yes. Thank you so
You're
much.
an interesting person. Now I know why people love you so much.
Aw,
We would love to have you back on the show
Yeah,
someday
you
if
know.
you'd have us. Let us.
we'll go through the faculty first.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Also, those questions were from your wife.
I'm pretty sure he knows.
Yeah.